مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. جميعنا يعرف قصص الرعب التي تدور من الخصوم الأجانب الذين يستخدمون حسابات مزيفة على مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي لنشر معلومات مغلوطة. قصص عن المتطرفين الذين يستغلون مواقع التواصل لتنظيم الأحداث المتطرفة مثل تمرد 6 يناير. قصص عن مالكي شركات مواقع التواصل الذين يخفضون التكاليف لتسهيل نشر الأكاذيب وحسابات الكراهية. وجميعنا يعرف كم نحن مدمنين على متابعة مواقع التواصل نفسها، حتى أولادنا مدمنون أكثر منا. ما هو تأثير مواقع التواصل على ديمقراطنا وعلى التوازن؟ هل هي قوة للخير أم للشر؟ هل أولادنا قلقون منها مثلنا؟ هل لدينا الأدوات لمعرفة الفرق بين الحقيقة الصعبة والأكاذيب الجذابة؟ لمناقشة المواقف حيال مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي وكيفية تأثيرها على السياسة في أمريكا اليوم، يسرني أن أستقبل خبيرين في مواقع التواصل: الدكتور ريتشارد وايك من مركز بيو للأبحاث، وخبيرة السياسة الرقمية كريستينا بودنر. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. The tech revolution, it has changed our lives. For the better? Well, mostly. But when it comes to politics, for many people, this is still an open question. We're going to discuss the tech revolution and how people's attitudes toward it, especially here in the United States, but even abroad, are changing. Changing generationally, changing on all sorts of issues. I'm delighted to welcome Richard White of the Pew Research Center and Christina Podner, who did a very important research to help explain all these interesting questions. So you did global survey about social media and politics around the world. Generally, what did you ask and what did you find? Richard.
Thanks very much, Rob. We did a survey earlier this year looking at public opinion in 19 countries. And these are mostly sort of economically advanced nations, but we've sort of done studies like this around the world as well. And what we want to do is explore how people think these technologies are impacting their societies. How are they impacting politics? And when you ask people about these things, what they say is that they see both some really good things and some really bad things. They feel like they're getting, in some ways, empowered by these technologies, but they also believe that things like social media are creating problems for their politics. We also asked them a kind of an overall summary question. Overall, when you think about social media, do you think it's had a good impact or a bad impact on democracy in our country? And when we do that, if you look across these 19 nations, 57% actually say it's had a good impact on democracy in their country, which runs a little bit, I think, counter maybe to some of the narratives when we talk about the role social media is having in our politics. But there is a major outlier, and that's the United States. In the US, only 34% say it's having a good impact, 64% saying it's having a negative impact. So in some ways on this study and in some other things that we do looking cross-nationally at public opinion, Americans stand out in kind of a negative way.
So, Christina, when I looked at the study, it seems like people like the feeling of empowerment that comes with access to social media. They get to be heard online. Is there any evidence that people are listening to the people who think that they're being heard?
Oh, absolutely. 100%, Rob. One of the things that we see, obviously, is if we kind of take a step back and look at the internet, right? The internet in and of itself, even before social media, was empowering to individuals because for the first time as individuals, we could do things like publish information on our own. We could have a blog. We could publish a web page, something that was as simple as getting that information out there. And so people started to get a taste very early on as to what it was like to be able to be heard outside of a newspaper or a radio show or, the evening news, which is what we relied on historically for our news. When social media came about, what we started to see is not just the enjoyment of being able to have our voices heard, but also engagement and two-way communication. With the virality of social media platforms like Meta's Facebook and Google, what we've seen is an inherent, I don't want to call it addiction yet, but it seems like we're trending in that direction, where people not only have enjoyed being able to have dialogue, have two-way conversation, but they're starting to enjoy and get feelings of empowerment of what it feels like to start to share information and possibly change perspectives of others on topics of politics, on vaccinations, on social issues, et cetera. And so what we see is that, social media, by the viral nature of the platforms, is encouraging people to buy into this model and to continue to enjoy this model. Sometimes, as you mentioned, good things come about, and sometimes not so good things come about. And that's, I think, what we're starting to see as a result of the study that Richard is pointing to.
So before we get into specifics about the United States, I was very, very interested to see the gap shrinking in terms of young people versus, shall we say, not so young people in how they approach social media and its connection with politics. One would have thought the young embrace tech innovations, but actually it's not such a clear-cut story, is it, Richard?
That's right. I think what you see is that in many countries, the age gap is closing in terms of people using social media, using technology. We've been tracking technology usage in different ways for a couple of decades now, and you still see young people using mobile technology, using social media more than older people. But again, that gap is shrinking, and the sort of older generations are catching up and becoming more and more likely to be online themselves, more and more likely to go online for information about politics and other things. So, as the years go on, it's a sort of broader set of people who are online that looks more and more like the total population, and it's less skewed towards younger people than it was, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago.
No, I didn't see this in the report, but my hunch is that the pandemic would have something to do with this. Christina?
Absolutely. I think that what we've seen is the pandemic exacerbate the situation. But I think, this is a good question for Richard. If we were already starting to see statistic trending in this direction, because I know even before the pandemic, we've had not just the rise of the large platforms like Facebook or Google, but also sort of these community-minded online social networks, if you will, like Nextdoor, which is very popular in the United States, where individuals really have enjoyed connecting at the local level. And so what's interesting about that is we already saw a tendency to have neighborhoods get onto Facebook groups and create Facebook groups for their specific neighborhoods. We've seen things like soccer teams in extracurricular activities get into social media platforms and use them for coordinating soccer practices for children. And so in general, it's not that surprising that we've seen an evening out across generations of, kind of after youth, if you will, into the social media realm. And then, as you mentioned, Rob, it was all very much exasperated by COVID. We weren't able to go out. We weren't able to socialize as much. Many of us have been removed from our families for a matter of years, if not months. And social media provided a very good way to continue to keep up with our friends, with our loved ones. And it became just really a pattern and a part of the tapestry of life.
Yeah. Now, that was a general comment about usage of social media. When it comes to connection between social media and democracy or political activity, very interesting finding that you mentioned earlier, Richard, about how Americans tend to have a different approach, a different attitude on this than many around the world. Can you delve into this a bit more?
That's right. You know, if you look at Americans versus the other publics we surveyed, they are more negative about the impact of social media on democracy in different ways. And it fits in, I think, with a broader picture of what we see right now when you do compare Americans to other publics around the world. They're more negative about politics, more divided than other countries. There's a few examples of this. So, you know, for example, we've asked people, what's been the impact of the pandemic on your country? Are people more divided or more united than they were before the pandemic? Americans are the most likely to say we're more divided now than we were before the pandemic. We asked people, you know, how divided do you think your country is along partisan lines? When we do that, Americans, along with a few other publics, really stand out and saying, you know, we're very divided along partisan lines. So I think in these questions about the impact of social media, what you're seeing reflected is a lot of the concerns that Americans have about the way politics is working in the country and sort of this division and this degree of polarization that we see in the United States in lots of different ways. You know, we have a two-party system here that can lead to these kind of stark divisions between the two different parties. And you see that in lots of ways, of course, in our politics. And it comes out when you ask these questions about what role social media is playing in our politics right now.
Christina, this the polling was done, if memory serves me right, over the first 6 months of 2022, approximately. This was before Elon Musk took over Twitter. Do you imagine that the numbers would even be worse in terms of perception of social media impact on American democratic attitudes today?
Absolutely. I think that there is an impact. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a slightly more negative outlook. But what I would do also is caution us. I think that a lot of folks think about social media because of what we're seeing and what we're hearing. So if we take, again, a step back and think about social media, inherently, it's not good or bad, and especially not good or bad for democracy. We have to place it in context, right? It can be used for either good or bad, depending on which kind of side you're on and what you're looking into. And so I think we need to understand that prior to the internet, news was in the domain of professional journalists, and there were definitely powerful gatekeepers in the form of editors and publishers. I think a lot of the distrust is coming from the fact that there really aren't any gatekeepers anymore. There really isn't a place of trust. Rob, we're talking to you today. Even though you're asking really great questions, there's a level of professionalism that you're bringing to this show. And if I said something that was completely untrue, like there's a bombing in downtown DC, I'm sure you would correct me right away and say, well, you know what? We don't see any news about that, Christina. I'm not sure that I can collaborate that at this moment. Well, we don't have those gatekeepers in the social media platforms today. And that's really why I believe that the folks in the United States, you know, the citizens of the United States are starting to have a more negative view of social media. You know, our platforms in the US definitely enjoy more broad immunity from responsibility, but, you know, from content created by users. And there is a very strong emphasis on the right to free speech through the First Amendment. And so that is something I think that folks are trusting less and less, coupled with the fact that we're living in these bubbles, if you will, bubbles of social media, where not only are we getting news and information, but we tend to get news and information only from those that are either polar opposites in our views or within our own social network, which means that we're reinforcing the same messaging over and over again. So the distrust is coming from a number of areas, including the fact that we're more and more aware of the fact that we're living in these bubbles, that there are not increased news sources, and there's certainly not diverse news sources when we're talking about Facebook and some of the other networks.
Oh, absolutely fascinating. We're going to continue this conversation talking about impressions of the tech revolution and how it impacts our democratic discourse and our engagement in public life here in the United States and around the world. We'll be back in just a moment. Again, my guests today include Richard Wyke. Richard is Director of Global Attitudes Research at Pew Research Center. He conducts research into international public opinion on a wide variety of topics. He's the author of numerous Pew Research Center reports and has written for The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, The Financial Times, and numerous other print outlets. Also joining us is Christina Podner. Christina has 2 decades experience as a technology consultant in digital policy and politics, with deep experience working with both the public and private sectors, including some of the world's largest and most innovative corporations. She's the author of The Power of Digital Policy, a practical guide to minimizing risk and maximizing opportunity for your organization. All right, I know from my own children, teens and early 20s kids, that Facebook is the Death Star and Mark Zuckerberg is Darth Vader. Why is this so common among American young people? Is this also a common view among young people around the world? Richard?
Well, we haven't asked people in other countries specifically about Facebook. We do know from our domestic research that certainly, as you say, it's not Facebook necessarily where the younger people are turning to. Increasingly, it's TikTok, right? TikTok is the platform that's really taken off as a place where young people go for information. It is interesting if you look at age differences in our data. It is, as we said, decreasingly we don't see as big of an age gap as we used to, but you do still see an age gap, and part of that is that young people are using different platforms than older people. They use it in different ways. And they're still a little more positive about the impact of technology than older people. They're more likely to say, it informs us. They're more likely to say it's having a positive impact on technology. So you do still see young people behaving a little bit differently online and also having some different attitudes about what all this technology is doing for our society.
I mean, with this increasing negativity about the connection between social media and politics in America, are we actually seeing Americans stay off these platforms, or they're using them regardless of their sense of negative impact on our politics? Christina?
I think we're definitely seeing people continue to use the platforms, and we will continue to see them used. I think it's really fascinating to watch, not just, as Richard pointed out, the platforms that younger generations are using, but how integrated they are in their everyday life. Children bring their phones to school because they actually use their phones at school. In many instances, they're issued Chromebooks, Google's Chromebooks, if you will, as a device through schools in the United States. And so from a very young age, they're always tethered to a device that has access to the internet, and certainly in a lot of instances to social media networks. And so I think that that's tying into the entire discourse around technology, democracy. How do we interact? How we get our news? What does that mean? I think we're seeing also a little bit of pushback. We recently saw a lawsuit in Washington state against big tech, indicating that social media is a public nuisance. It's distracting to our youth. It's actually harming them. It's not helping them. And so I think on the whole, the democratic discourse is happening, I think, much more natively with the younger generations, but it's certainly also shaping how we think about it from those in the older generations. I think what's interesting, though, when I've talked to younger kids, especially in some of the research that I've done, they tend to actually relay, not in adult language, but in terms of concepts, that they understand that social media is a type of monopoly. It's a type of one-on-one intercourse in terms of the dialogue that they're having. And they understand things like, social media is actually manipulative of me. They're showing me ads. They're not necessarily trying to get me to be honest with my friends, or maybe what I'm sharing with my friends isn't as impactful. I know for my teenage son, I've asked him, what's the joy of, using Snapchat, especially when you're taking a photo of your shoe. And it's not really the photo of the shoe or the ground that he's enjoying sharing with his friends. It's the fact that Snapchat rewards streaks. And so there's a gaming aspect to how long can we keep our streak alive amongst friends.
Richard White, Christina Podner, thank you very much for joining me on Dakhel, Washington. It's time to age myself. When I was a student journalist 40 years ago, I used a little flip pad to take notes during interviews, a real pen on real paper. When I went abroad to do dissertation research, I convinced my father to help me buy a first-generation laptop computer. It weighed 14 pounds. It was a compact 286. 6 months in Africa and half the screen died. I wrote a 400-page dissertation on 12 lines of screen. When I came back to America, I heard about a new invention called email. My secretary asked whether she should send telephone messages via this new technology, or should she continue to write them on slips of paper and leave them on people's desks. My answer then was, oh, it'll be a fad. Let's just stick with paper. Soon thereafter, I got my first mobile phone. It was a flip phone. I loved it and kept it forever. I say all this not to admit that I'm a Luddite, someone who rejects technological innovation. It's to admit that I have changed. I've undergone a conversion. I've come to embrace technology. I now love the idea that I can talk anywhere, anytime, face to face with almost anyone in the world on my iPhone. I love the idea that I can host a live event with people who could never appear in the same room, people on other sides of battle lines, people who speak different languages, people who don't have the benefit of passports, thanks to the wonder of Zoom. I now love the idea that I can, thanks to Twitter, transmit my thoughts and ideas instantaneously in 256 letter bursts to the entire world, breaking news faster than humans have ever done in the history of time. But let's be realistic. These remarkable advances come at a cost. The instantaneous, global, and unfiltered explosion of thoughts and ideas also means the instantaneous dissemination of lies, slander, and disinformation that could fuel hatred and violence, of rumors and secrets that could destroy lives and reputations, of images, photos, and videos that could drive people, young and old, to end their lives rather than live with seeing the horror and shame in the eyes of others. Technology has always been a double-edged sword. Thousands of years ago, the same technology, the wheel, that allowed an ox to pull a cart, also allowed a horse to pull a chariot. Later on, the same technology that gave us amazing vaccines that saved millions also gave us the most terrible toxins and biological weapons. And the same technology that could turn the lights on in 1 million homes created weapons that could kill millions with a single bomb. The question is not really the technology. The question is us. Are we smart enough to control our creation, to limit its use, to set rules that everyone follows, that are at such a high cost of breaking that we are all safe? Or will we succumb to our worst impulses? Will we fail to protect ourselves and the weakest among us? Will we let technology rule us instead of the other way around? When I think of the excesses of technology today and the uses to which it is being put by bad actors around the world, I think less of the innovation than of the human impulse that guides us. As Shakespeare said, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in the stars, but in ourselves. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص بشأن دور مواقع التواصل في الانتخابات الأمريكية، تواصلوا معي رجاء عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو راسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @RobSatloff. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم.